My fellow Pennsylvanians and friends old and new, greetings, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Michael Smith. The goal of this video series is to bring attention to the moral and legal abuses by not only St. Luke's Hospital and its affiliates, but by the Bethlehem Police Department and Monroe County Children and Youth Services. This is the second video of a series that will detail the legal case of the Smith family versus St. Luke's Hospital and many other parties. This video will focus on the second third of the facts section of the case. If you would like to start at the beginning of the story, there is a link below. Also, if you would like to follow along with me, there's another link below to all the papers that I've already filed with the court, the complaint being among them, so you can download it and just follow along as I read if you'd like. Alright, what follows is a tale of if this is your first time joining us, what follows is a tale of a newborn child being separated from his family without good cause, and the lengths that St. Luke's Hospital, the local police, and Monroe County, CYS, would go to cause needless trauma to myself, my wife, and my newborn baby child. I hope you feel compelled by the facts of the case to learn more about our plight and what you can do to help. I would also like to thank Peter Hall and Leaf Grease of the Allentown Morning Call for writing an article that accurately portrays the position of my family. I'd also like to thank MSN.com for picking up the story on its homepage. If you would like to read the article about my case for yourself, you can also find that in another link below. And now for a poem about rats. They don't eat, they don't sleep, they don't feed, they don't seethe. Bare their gums when they moan and squeak, and lick the dirt off a larger one's feet. They don't push, don't crowd, congregate until they're much too loud, procreate until they're dead, drink the blood of their so-called best friend. But I promise you, these rats will scurry when something bigger comes their way. On with the story. Here is Smith v. St. Luke's et al. Facts section, part 2. I am beginning on line 148 in the facts section, in the first facts section. Okay, if you remember where we left off, Grace and I had just come back to her postpartum hospital room to have dinner. I had already eaten. Grace was in the middle of her dinner, and this was the first time that since newborn baby Jazz was in the NICU that both of us had been out of the NICU at the same time. So that catches us up to where we're going to start. So here we go on line 148. Leaving newborn baby Jazz's NICU pod for the meal for Mrs. Smith to eat dinner in Mr. Smith's presence. In Mrs. Smith's postpartum hospital room was the first time. Right, I just told you that. Okay. Alright, so here's where we're starting off. At approximately 7 p.m. on April 9th, 2021, defendant Ms. Teresa Marlino, MD, entered plaintiff Mrs. Smith's postpartum hospital room. Plaintiff Mrs. Smith had just finished her dinner, and she and plaintiff Mr. Smith were preparing to return to newborn baby Jazz's NICU pod. Dr. Marlino held herself out to be a representative of defendant St. Luke's Hospital and that she was in charge of obstetrician residents at St. Luke's. 2 other nurses were present in Mrs. Smith's postpartum hospital room. Dr. Marlino sat herself down in a chair opposite Mrs. Smith's hospital bed. I was seated in a chair next to Mrs. Smith's hospital bed, between the bed and the window. And at this point, Mrs. Smith had just finished her meal. Dr. Marlino did not ever do any sort of medical examination of Mrs. Smith the entire time that she was a patient at St. Luke's. Dr. Marlino, upon arriving, began interrogating plaintiffs Mr. and Mrs. Smith about the nature of their lives and occupations. From the perspective of plaintiffs Mr. and Mrs. Smith, defendant Dr. Marlino had an aggressive demeanor and posture while interrogating them. After interrogating us for some time, Dr. Marlino accused Mrs. Smith of having ingested methamphetamine and having passed the deleterious effects of methamphetamine ingestion onto newborn baby Jazz. Plaintiffs, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, knowing that Mrs. Smith had never ingested methamphetamine, attempted to reason with defendant Ms. Marlino, MD, that there was no reasonable cause to believe that plaintiff Mrs. Smith had ingested methamphetamine, nor that she had passed the deleterious effects of such harmful substances onto her newborn baby. Dr. Marlino stated that the evidence that Mrs. Smith ingested methamphetamine was incontrovertible. Dr. Marlino stated to us that, quote, and I can't believe this happened in this conversation, but that Mrs. Smith, quote, got it, referring to methamphetamine, off the street for all she knows. So, Dr. Marlino acted in such an appalling manner that she was requested to leave Mrs. Smith's postpartum hospital room by myself and Mrs. Smith no less than 4 times before she finally acquiesced. Dr. Marlino made it clear to plaintiffs Mr. and Mrs. Smith that she thought that Mrs. Smith was a drug abuser and that she also abused her newborn baby son. Dr. Marlino made it clear to us that she would be contacting CYS to report Mrs. Smith as a methamphetamine abuser. Mr. and Mrs. Smith suffered a catastrophic loss of trust in defendant St. Luke's Hospital as a result of Dr. Marlino's conducts and her communications to us. Mrs. Smith verbally withdrew consent for further treatment for herself and newborn baby Jazz to Dr. Marlino. Plaintiff Mrs. Smith then turned to me to see if I concurred with her judgment. I did agree, and then I seconded the verbal withdrawing of consent for further treatment of newborn baby Jazz. Mr. and Mrs. Smith instructed Dr. Marlino to begin the appropriate paperwork and procedures to have newborn baby Jazz removed entirely to the care of his parents. Neither Mr. and Mrs. Smith acted in a violent nature or forceful manner towards Dr. Marlino or any other hospital staff. I cannot stress that enough. Despite the outrageous accusations being levied against us, I never so much as raised my voice. Mr. and Mrs. Smith were prepared to take newborn baby Jazz to Lehigh Valley Hospital to have his condition evaluated by professional medical staff at another location unaffiliated with defendant St. Luke's Hospital. We were willing, not to completely disavow everything that they said, but things weren't adding up at that point. Let's just say it that way. Because we had never been told that newborn baby Jazz had a life-threatening condition, or that his condition would become life-threatening if the treatments that he were undergoing in the NICU were discontinued. But I would like to point out that at no point were we advised to obtain a second opinion by any of the St. Luke's Hospital staff or any of their assigns or agents. That no one told us. We were neither were we offered the ability to appeal decisions made by anybody. So there was no process whereby we could disagree with what Dr. Marlino had asserted to us. It was just, Grace is a meth user. You pass the effects of meth abuse onto your child in utero, therefore you are a child abuser. That was St. Luke's assertion. When Dr. Marlino left Mrs. Smith's postpartum hospital room, Mr. Smith, returned immediately to the NICU and informed the nurse at the desk that all consent for care and treatment of newborn baby Jazz had been withdrawn, and that she should inform the appropriate staff so she could begin the discharging process. Like taking the needles out of them and stuff like that. I mean, like the tubes and, all the other stuff. Because, if they weren't offering to help us, we need to get them out of there. Not to mention, let's just stick to what I wrote. Mr. Smith then entered plaintiff newborn baby Jazz's NICU pod and kissed him on the forehead. Me. So then I left to go get the car seat. And I whispered, to my baby boy that he was going to get his car. I was going to go get his car seat, but I would be right back soon. I then exited the hospital and pulled our SUV into the semicircular patient pickup area close to the doors of the hospital entrance, and then I went back inside the hospital and brought the car seat with me. I brought the car seat with me back to Grace's postpartum hospital room where Mrs. Smith had collected her belongings. So while I was off tending to the baby and the other processes, Grace was cleaning her stuff up in the room. We placed her belongings onto a wheeled cart and returned to the NICU. When we got returned to the NICU, St. Luke's Hospital had locked down the NICU to prevent us from reuniting with our child. They sealed all the doors to the NICU, meaning that everyone but hospital personnel, and including sealing all the doors to everyone but hospital personnel, and placing guards at each entrance to the NICU from the NICU waiting area to prevent the plaintiffs from entering the NICU. The doors were locked. We couldn't get back to our child. It's that simple. When guards were questioned, so when I was like, hey, why can't I get in? Nobody would give me a reason. 2 other mothers and many hospital staff were present in the NICU waiting area where all of us were waiting to be reunited. Waiting to go about their business, wanting to see their children as well. Approximately 20 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived on the scene by exiting the center elevator to the lobby area. The 2 police officers that arrived on the scene were from the Bethlehem Township Police Department in Northampton County, Pennsylvania. 2 police officers. The names of the 2 police officers that arrived on the scene were defendants Officer Andrew Keok and Thomas A. Smith, both of whom were patrolmen. From the perspective of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Officer Keok was agitated and had a confrontational personality. From our perspective, the defendant, Officer Keok, had determined that Mr. Smith was a, quote, bad person before he had consulted with either the plaintiffs or defendant St. Luke's Hospital staff. When Officer Keok arrived on the scene, he literally did. He burst out of the elevator towards Mr. Smith, towards me, who was seated directly in front of the elevators, approximately 20 feet from the elevators. And then Keok demanded in a loud voice to me to know what's the problem here. Like, he jumped out of the elevators, essentially, at me, and very forcefully was like, what's the problem here? And not having no interest to actually investigate what our side of the story actually was. It was clear that he had made up his mind, and whatever came out of my mouth did not matter at that point. Officer Smith moved in a position towards Mrs. Smith in a position between herself and the elevators. Mrs. Smith was in a wheelchair while remaining seated in the NICU lobby waiting area, so it's not like she was going anywhere fast anyway. From our perspective, defendant Officer Keok continued to ask me questions in an abrasive manner, and he was very close to my face. It really felt like he was trying to get a rise of anger out of me to justify his own anger. Like, oh, if I can get this guy just as pissed off in this outrageous situation where he has every right to be pissed off, well, then that'll validate my own anger as a human being. That's the way Keok was acting towards me, and I did not respond in kind. I was calm, cool, and collected. I was seething below the surface. I was sending all sorts of hate out through the force, but I was calm, cool, and collected. I never spoke out of turn, and I never raised my voice. I never, ever, once, not once, did I use an obscenity. Not towards anybody. Not in this whole situation. Despite the disrespectful tone constantly sent my way, I spoke in a respectful manner in both form and tone throughout the abrasive questioning. Then Keok went over and behind closed doors and talked to St. Luke's Hospital employees, agents, or assigns about the current situation with us. Mr. Smith finally had an opening of the conversation and properly introduced himself and requested that the as yet unknown responding officer do the same. You have to understand, I didn't know Keok's name at this point. He had just come out of the elevator at me. And so after he was done essentially, grilling me harshly, I responded, with So we haven't even gotten each other's names here. Can you tell me your name? And you know what his answer to me was when I asked him respectfully what his name was? He said, "I'm the cop, that's all you need to know." I actually had to get his name off the police report. Then Keok, after I asked him his name, he audibly scoffed at me like, "I can't believe he even asked me that." Like asking a police officer his name in a respectful tone is what? In any event, let's move on. So there I was sitting. Officer Smith remained in the NICU lobby waiting area next to Mrs. Smith between her and the elevator doors. When I needed to use the bathroom adjacent to the lobby, and I was escorted by Officer Smith from my seat to the restroom like I was a prisoner. Some minutes later, Officer Keok returned to the NICU lobby waiting area. Keok brusquely conveyed to the plaintiffs, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, that they must immediately leave St. Luke's property or else they would be arrested for defiant trespassing. Keok also said there was no way in which Grace, Mrs. Smith, would be able to stay with her newborn baby child. Neither of us were allowed to say goodbye to him either. They were like, "Nope, too bad, so sad." That was the attitude. Get off my property. The reason given for the ejection of plaintiffs Mr. and Mrs. Smith from defendant St. Luke's Hospital premises was that Mrs. Smith was a methamphetamine addict and that St. Luke's Hospital no longer would tolerate our presence on defendant St. Luke's Hospital property, which, by the way, doesn't detail why I should be kicked out. I mean, it's not reasonable to kick somebody out of the hospital on the basis that they're a meth addict anyway and they just gave birth, which is one of the accusations I make in the case. But anyway, Mrs. Smith expressed concerns that she was breastfeeding and that there would be no skin-to-skin contact with her newborn child, and that these are major concerns to both of us. Then enter another individual named Dr. Cynthia Schultz. She was the senior doctor in charge of the NICU that evening. Mrs. Smith's concerns about breastfeeding and skin-to-skin contact were orally directed towards Dr. Cynthia Schultz. From the perspective of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Dr. Schultz took a condescending attitude towards our concerns and simply expressed to us that Mrs. Smith's concerns were, quote, no concern of hers. That's swell. She then asserted to us that we would be arrested even if the only reason that they returned to the hospital property was to pick up our child and take him home. Wouldn't even allowed to come back days later to pick up our own child from the hospital. Based on what? St. Luke's Hospital instructed us to contact Northampton County CYS. When we did contact Northampton County CYS, we were told that because we live in Monroe County and not Northampton County, that we would have to contact Monroe County CYS, Children in Youth Services. Mr. and Mrs. Smith contacted Monroe County CYS and told that no one would be available to examine the plaintiff's case until the case was assigned to a caseworker on Monday, and it was currently Friday night, which, by the way, is against the law. In emergency situations, there's always supposed to be someone available. There wasn't. Just, nah, not doing that this weekend. We don't wanna. In order to avoid arrest, in addition to being separated from our child, we voluntarily left St. Luke's Hospital without our child. Leaving St. Luke's Hospital property under armed escort and under threat of arrest while being forced to leave our newborn child in the NICU caused us a devastating amount of mental anguish. Upon exiting St. Luke's Hospital, Mr. and Mrs. Smith were ordered to immediately leave the premises, which obviously we were going to do anyway. We could not leave, though, because they had blocked in our car. Like, there was one of them parked in front of us and one of them parked behind us. You know, in case we'd actually tried to take our child legally out of the hospital like we were legally allowed to. Officers had to be requested by myself to move so that we could. They were almost kind of like even oblivious to the fact that I couldn't leave immediately. It was almost like, well, they were standing around waiting for me, and I'm looking at them, and they're looking at me, and I'm going, you have to move your car so I can get out. And they're like, oh, okay. Derp, derp, derp. Like, I always had to be the one thinking rationally in this situation. And I was the victim. I'm one of the victims the entire time. It's even tiresome to think about now. As we left the hospital, Mrs. Smith began to suffer from a debilitating and devastating anxiety attack, of course. We proceeded directly home to Tobyhanna, back where we live, which is in the Poconos. We got back home sometime after midnight, between midnight and 1:30. Obviously, we had a great deal of difficulty sleeping that night because of all that psychological trauma. Later, on the morning of April 10th, plaintiffs Mr. and Mrs. Smith recorded a video that we posted on the internet explaining that our situation with the hospital in an effort to bring attention to the injustices against us. A network of family and friends helped to disseminate the plaintiff's video plea for help. Thank you for that still. On April 10th, 2021, so Saturday after, at approximately 5:45 p.m., a representative of St. Luke's Hospital phoned Mrs. Smith to inform her that as a result of decisions by the legal department that she was allowed to come back into the hospital to care for her son. I wasn't. No reason given for that. Except for, quote, she was not the problem, implying that I was the problem, which doesn't explain why she wasn't allowed to stay the entire time then, especially when we voiced concerns relating to breastfeeding and skin-to-skin contact. Mr. and Mrs. Smith were confused as to the rationale that strongly implied that Mr. Smith was the cause of the plaintiff's ejection from St. Luke's Hospital the previous night, when it was made clear to the plaintiffs that the reason that they were being ejected from St. Luke's Hospital property was because St. Luke's Hospital would no longer tolerate the presence of a meth addict and a child abuser, which they were saying is you, Mrs. Smith. You were the meth addict / child abuser. At approximately 7:10 that Saturday evening, Mrs. Smith was allowed to return to St. Luke's Hospital property, but get this, it doesn't end there. At no time did St. Luke's Hospital rescind the no trespass order with Bethlehem Township Police Department. So they could have just called her a trespasser and had her arrested literally at any time, even though they were like, yeah, come on back. Upon arrival, the entrance to the women's pavilions was locked and the entrance lights were turned off. Now, you need to understand, and if you've ever met my wife, you've surely seen the giant leg brace that she wears. Well, it's obvious. It's bulky, and she's had it for years. She had a snowboarding accident years ago that has resulted in, I think, 3 knee surgeries, 2 of which, there may even be more than 3, and I know 2 of this were actually done in St. Luke's Hospital. Yeah. So then she had to, so I don't know if you don't know how the building's set up, but essentially what happened is she was then, because she parked by the women's and children's section of the building, had to walk all the way to the main section, postpartum, with a knee injury, back inside. Where she had then to go up to the second floor, so double all the way back internally to the receptionist desk on the second floor where we started this whole business just 2 evenings prior. No wheelchairs were located at the main entrance either, and there was no one there who was willing to help her. The same receptionist that initially improperly checked in plaintiff Mrs. Smith on April 8th was then working when Mrs. Smith approached the receptionist desk with her parents' assistance. So Grace wasn't alone during this, okay? Her father and mother had accompanied her with, and so they made this walk too, and they are not young. Mrs. Smith stated to the receptionist through a mask that she was Julian's mom. The receptionist, without asking for any identification, asking any other relevant questions, picked up a phone near to her and stated into it, "Julian's mom, quote, Julian's mom is here. Yeah, she's in the lobby." After several minutes, a male guard escorted Mrs. Smith through the double doors of the NICU into plaintiff newborn baby Jazz's NICU pod. Plaintiff Mrs. Smith noticed that his NICU pod had a number written on the outside of his pod, as opposed to with the printed version of his name being outside the NICU pod, which would have been in kind with the other NICU pods surrounding his own. So the fact that it was just strange to her that our child is labeled number and other children are labeled their name. There's just something suspicious about that. It just seems that way to us. Between when plaintiff Mrs. Smith was initially contacted by defendant St. Luke's Hospital earlier in the evening when she actually arrived at the hospital, the nurse's shift had changed. So late into the 7 o'clock hour, plaintiff Mrs. Smith's parents waited for her in the lobby because it was not yet known whether or not Mrs. Smith would be allowed to remain overnight with her child. So, literally, for what would come to be hours, Grace she was allowed to be with Jazz, but her parents had to wait outside of the NICU lobby to find out whether or not they were driving her home back to me or not. That still hadn't been conveyed. The current nurse on duty in the NICU was unsure if Mrs. Smith would be allowed to remain the night with newborn baby Jazz, and the nurse sought out such knowledge from a superior, meaning it wasn't where in the medical records. They could write down a lot of negative stuff, couldn't convey basic instructions, though, about what had obviously should have been a prearranged situation before Mrs. Smith had even arrived back at the hospital. Yes, she can stay. No, she cannot. If she can stay, this is how long. Sometime thereafter, it was affirmed to plaintiff Mrs. Smith that she may remain the night with her newborn son. Something. At approximately 7:51 p.m., plaintiff Mrs. Smith phoned her parents who were waiting in the NICU lobby waiting area and saying that she could stay the night and that they could leave the hospital. Defendant male security guards were placed around the clock at newborn baby Jazz's NICU pod to constantly observe the behavior of plaintiff Mrs. Smith. Yeah, think about that. The pillow and blanket that plaintiff Mrs. Smith used the day before when she was a patient were left behind, and plaintiff Mrs. Smith was able to use them again. So it doesn't seem like anybody cleaned the room while we were gone. On the night of April 10th to 11th, postpartum and disabled plaintiff Mrs. Smith uncomfortably slept in an upright chair. Nice. How accommodating. Plaintiff Mrs. Smith observed more wires attached to newborn baby Jazz than when she had last observed him on April 9th, 2021. So on the April 10th, on the night of the 10th to the 11th, that Saturday, into Sunday, when newborn baby Jazz needed to breastfeed, postpartum and disabled plaintiff Mrs. Smith would have to get up out of her upright chair unaided with a disabled knee, untangle and reorganize roughly half a dozen cords and his breathing tube, and then extend all of that with enough slack merely so she could feed newborn baby Jazz. Whenever newborn baby Jazz's oxygen level would dip below 90, an alarm would beep loudly. If the alarm associated with Jazz's oxygen level lasted for approximately 20 to 30 seconds, a nurse would attend to newborn baby Jazz and remedy the alarm. Mrs. Smith observed that when newborn baby Jazz's oxygen levels triggered the attendant alarm, it was due to a cord or medical attachment to newborn baby Jazz slipping into a wrong position. Mrs. Smith observed that roughly half the time that newborn baby Jazz's oxygen levels triggered the attendant alarm, it was able to be remedied by a NICU nurse making a slight tilt of newborn baby Jazz's head or neck. That's it. Cured. In order to observe plaintiff Mrs. Smith by male guards, nurses, and other hospital staff and personnel, the curtains to newborn baby Jazz's NICU pod were always kept partially open. No privacy for a postpartum breastfeeding mother. No privacy. Both to and from the restroom, Grace was also observed by a male hospital guard each time she went. Now, mind you, she's a postpartum woman, so she needs to visit these facilities regularly to attend to issues that relate to recovering from childbirth. She actually had to say these things to the guards because she was so closely observed that she felt that if she didn't tell everybody what she was doing exactly every moment of time, she would be separated from her child again. Male security guards would frequently and without cause just look in through the curtain at the NICU pod at Mrs. Smith whenever they wanted. Just, ooh, here I am, checking things out. What's going on? The presence of all of these, there's 3 of them, there's 3 different ones, but in the presence of these 3 different male guards intimidated an already traumatized plaintiff, Mrs. Smith. No accommodations were ever offered to her as a postpartum mother by any defendant. No accommodations were ever offered to her as obviously, observably disabled woman by the hospital either. On the morning of Sunday, April 11th, 2021, a new security guard was placed outside of Jazz's NICU pod to observe her behavior again. So 1 security guard when she gets there that evening, 2nd one next shift next morning. Mrs. Smith, in repeated acts of humiliation, felt compelled to make it clear when she was going to the restroom. I'll talk to you about that. Grace suffered constant nervousness and an anxiety from being under constant scrutiny by St. Luke's Hospital's employees, agents, and assigns, down to feeling compelled to explain her bodily functions as a postpartum mother. Because they thought, what it really makes you wonder what they thought. Did they think she was going to be doing meth in his NICU pod? Did they, who were they protecting? Were they guarding Grace or were they guarding Julian? Well, it would seem Grace because they would even follow her, observe her to the bathroom, that sort of a thing. God, they were short of actually standing there in her while she's changed herself. At approximately 6:30 a.m. on April 11th, the attending NICU nurse informed Mrs. Smith that newborn baby Jazz should be able to have his oxygen tubes removed that day. That's good news. Moving in the right direction there, Mrs. Smith requested to know how long it would be before he would be able to return home. The attending NICU nurse informed plaintiff Mrs. Smith that newborn baby Jazz, quote, needs to be stable off the air for 12 hours, end quote. At approximately 9:50 a.m., newborn baby Jazz had his oxygen tube removed and his antibiotic IV removed. The attending NICU nurse informed plaintiff Mrs. Smith about a newborn baby Jazz that they would, quote, we would like to watch him for 24 hours after taking him off the air, end quote. From the perspective of Mrs. Smith, now every time she heard an alarm for newborn baby Jazz's oxygen dip, even slightly, that alarm would trigger intense anxiety. Because to her it was restarting the clock every time. We never knew if that shoe was going to drop, right? Oh, here we go, starting over. Plaintiff Mrs. Smith was also informed of 2 new factual requirements from defendant St. Luke's Hospital before they would consider discharging newborn baby Jazz. Number 1, plaintiff Smith family would have to be cleared for discharge by Children and Youth Services. Number 2, plaintiff newborn baby Jazz would have a follow-up appointment scheduled with the pediatrician, which should take place no later than the following Wednesday. Before they would give him back to us, we had to schedule an appointment with a doctor, and we had to be cleared by CYS. So was this medically related or not? Since it was a Sunday, the Children and Youth Services and CYS still didn't care about us and didn't see us until the following day. It was not possible to schedule a follow-up appointment because pediatricians' offices are, what? Take a guess on a Sunday, closed. And because an additional arbitrary 12 hours were required to observe newborn baby Jazz, it became evident to Mr. and Mrs. Smith that it would be impossible to return home that Sunday. So now it's going to have to be Monday because, once again, they set a standard that was impossible to meet, right? Well, we know they can't do this today, which means we gotta keep them until tomorrow. Their problem is the CYS had already cleared them Friday night when they were first contacted, and it's in the medical records that they did so. So they were saying something would have to happen, which had already happened, and they were presenting that information to us as if we didn't know it. Because we didn't at that point. Think about that. As it was approaching noon that Sunday, Mrs. Smith realized that she hadn't eaten since arriving at the hospital the previous day. St. Luke's never offered postpartum and disabled plaintiff Mrs. Smith any food or drink while she attended newborn baby Jazz. When Mrs. Smith informed the guard watching her that she was going to the cafeteria, the guard escorted her there. A postpartum mother with a disabled knee hobbled a considerable distance at a pace set by the guard that was too fast for her to the cafeteria without being offered a wheelchair. A real gentleman there. After reaching the cafeteria, the guard went on his way elsewhere. Mrs. Smith ordered food and sat down at the table to eat. Mrs. Smith found it difficult to eat because of all the stress and anxiety she was suffering under given the present situation. Mrs. Smith contacted her parents and emotionally unloaded on them for some time. Mrs. Smith was in the cafeteria for approximately 45 minutes. Then she packed extra food into her purse for both dinner and breakfast the next morning because being away from Jazz for even within the same building and only for a short time was having a severely debilitating effect on her psyche. Mrs. Smith slowly made her way back to the NICU pod because of her knee. Upon returning to the NICU, plaintiff Mrs. Smith was rounding a corner to the nurse's station when she overheard a guard telling a nurse that was not related to newborn baby Jazz's care or treatment, quote, I'm not sure, I walked her down to the cafeteria about an hour ago. Oh, here she is. End quote. From the plaintiff's perspective, Mrs. Smith observed that she was the subject of general conversation within St. Luke's Hospital, regardless of their affiliation with the child or Mrs. Smith. So this guard, who she hadn't met yet, I'm not sure. Yeah, anyway. It seems that I'm not sure if it was the same guard or a different guard at that point, but in one way, either way, she was the topic of hospital gossip being the point. At approximately noon on April 11, 2021, St. Luke's Hospital social worker Vanessa visited the NICU pod. So look at that, a social worker can show up at the NICU pod. Defendant St. Luke's Hospital social worker Vanessa spoke to plaintiff Mrs. Smith and conveyed a vague apology to the plaintiff Mrs. Smith for the actions of defendant St. Luke's Hospital. St. Luke's Hospital social worker Vanessa also conveyed to Mrs. Smith that a second CYS report was made based on the, quote, incident that took place on the evening of April 9, 2021. I have, to this day, still no idea what's in that report. I hope to get that in discovery. That ain't gonna be good for anyone on their side. It ain't gonna make their story better. Because I am not what they say I am in that report. I can at least tell you that much. As we continue the story, you'll see why I say that with such confidence. I continue. Let's see. Vanessa also conveyed that all of its St. Luke's Hospital's employees, assigns and/or agents and/or assigns were following St. Luke's policy concerning how the, quote, incident played out on the evening of April 9, 2021. St. Luke's Hospital social worker Vanessa also conveyed that St. Luke's Hospital was following Pennsylvania state law concerning, quote, the incident and how it played out. Okay. We'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. Social worker Vanessa never conveyed which policies and procedures defendant St. Luke's Hospital was adhering to concerning its treatment of the Smith family. Social worker Vanessa never conveyed. Yeah, right. She also attempted to convince Mrs. Smith that Mrs. Smith still had custody of newborn baby Jazz, despite the fact that Mrs. Smith did not have the ability did not have the ability to have control of newborn baby Jazz's medical decisions, nor the right to terminate consent for treatment, as plaintiff Mrs. Smith had unequivocally done 2 days before. So, no, we didn't. No, she didn't. Those are just words. Words are just words. A rose is but a rose by any other name. Proof's in the pudding, blah, blah, blah. Vanessa also conveyed that she had, quote, been in touch with CYS, end quote, but that no one was available to handle this case because it was the weekend. Who was she talking to then? Seems like somebody had heard about the case over the weekend, but they weren't concerned enough about this situation to at least discuss it with my wife and I. You know, being that we were such a phone call away. Social worker Vanessa repeatedly asked plaintiff Mrs. Smith throughout the conversation if Mrs. Smith had, quote, custody of her other children. Mind you, this woman works for the hospital, but she's acting like a state social worker. Why does she care about custody of my wife's custody of her children? What's that to her? Sounds like she was acting like the state agency to me. Was she working directly on their behalf, or was this her own idea? Was this the hospital's idea? I don't know. I'll find out. It ain't going to be good for the defendants, I'll tell you that much. On the afternoon of April 11, 2021, Mrs. Smith's septuagenarian parents, so they're in their 70s, arrived at St. Luke's Hospital and respectfully requested to speak with the hospital administrator on duty that day to discuss the separation of their children from their grandchildren. A reasonable request to make in light of the current situation. The defendant St. Luke's Hospital response to my in-laws was that the current hospital administrator told them to immediately gave the order apparently to have these two immediately vacate the property, or else Mrs. Smith's parents would be arrested by local police under a no trespass order as well. So there's that. Mrs. Smith's At all times, plaintiff Mrs. Smith's septuagenarian parents were kind, respectful to St. Luke's Hospital employees, agents, and assigns. No one acted like they were feeling inside, despite everybody's righteous indignance too. Throughout the course of the afternoon and evening of April 11th, multiple tests were performed on newborn baby Jazz against the will and consent of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. On the morning of Monday, April 12, 2021, against the will and consent of myself and my wife, another bilirubin test was performed on newborn baby Jazz. Mrs. Smith was informed by a representative of St. Luke's that now newborn baby Jazz would not be able to be discharged until the results of the bilirubin test came back from the lab. Then, defendant Ms. Patricia Bates, CRNP, while acting on behalf of her employer, lulled a vulnerable plaintiff, Mrs. Smith, into a conversation that enticed Mrs. Smith to express her feelings about herself. So she got Grace to talk about her feelings in relation to how she was feeling about the situation, not how she was relating about anything else around her or herself, like her child, just how she feels about what's going on. And Mrs. Smith was under the impression that defendant Ms. Bates, CRNP, was attempting to sympathize with her when plaintiff Mrs. Smith confessed the depths of her misery to the defendant. At the conclusion of plaintiff Mrs. Smith's expressions of her misery and anxieties, defendant Ms. Patricia Bates, CRNP, stated to plaintiff Mrs. Smith, quote, "I don't care if you were the preacher's daughter, we're required to report it by law." End quote. Not comforting words. From the perspective of plaintiff Mrs. Smith, she felt that she was being called inherently immoral because she did not represent the apparent moral paragon of a, quote, preacher's daughter even. From the perspective of Mrs. Smith, she thought that the intent behind Ms. Bates' words was that there did not exist any room within existing Pennsylvania law for the defendant St. Luke's Hospital to deviate from any policy for affirmatively contacting state children and youth services if a postpartum mother tests positive for amphetamines. At approximately 10:30 a.m. on April 12th, so this is Monday, a representative of Monroe County CYS, Mr. Tim Shaw, arrived at St. Luke's Hospital and interviewed Mrs. Smith. Tim Shaw took pictures of Mrs. Smith's ID, prescription pill bottles, and prescription marijuana card, because what was she going to do, saying no? Mr. Shaw personally escorted Mrs. Smith to and from a restroom to collect a urine sample to test for drugs. So another person treating my wife like she's in prison can't just do what the doctor does, hand her the cup and say, all right, we'll see you in a minute. No. Gotta escort her to and from. God knows she might switch that pee out with somebody else's. What are they thinking? It seems like every step of the way is designed to humiliate and further degrade. Tim Shaw, on the way to the restroom to collect the urine sample from Mrs. Smith, inquired, quote, has the security guard been there all weekend? Mrs. Smith responded to Mr. Shaw's inquiry affirmatively. Tim Shaw then represented to plaintiff Mrs. Smith that he, quote, I've never seen anything like that. We, CYS, told them, defendant St. Luke's Hospital, on the 10th that you were okay to be alone there with the baby. So that's the night of the incident. So CYS was totally okay with the mom remaining with the child the entire time. There's something to put in your pipe and smoke for a while, When Mr. Shaw exited the newborn baby Jazz's NICU pod after having a confidential conversation with Mrs. Smith, he pulled back the curtains to find the St. Luke's Hospital social worker immediately on the other side of the curtain, eavesdropping on the conversation between Mrs. Smith and Mr. Shaw. So, never any confidentiality there. Gotta always have one ear in the convo. Simultaneously, at approximately 10:30 a.m. on April 12, 2021, a representative of Monroe County CYS, Mr. George Mansoria, arrived at our house. Upon arrival to the residence, defendant Mr. George Mansoria was literally shaking with fear at the thought of having to approach me. He was literally shaking from fear. So much adrenaline had been dumped into his bloodstream that he was shaking violently as he approached me, which tells me inherently that the emotional content that was in that second report was a very emotionally compelling towards making me seem like an outrageous, angry individual. At all times, I was kind to Mr. Mansoria, and I maintained the demeanor of a reasonable and friendly person. Because of my welcoming demeanor, Mr. Mansoria calmed down and literally stopped shaking. I had to calm him down. I'm the one who's the victim in this situation, undergoing an investigation by the state, and I'm going, dude, it's cool, it's alright, let's just take a minute, I want you to stand by the door and we'll chat for a few, and then we'll see where things go from there, okay? That's the approach that I have. And should a deposition be required of Mr. Mansoria, I think it'll be clear in that deposition what my demeanor was. This led to him being open and friendly with me. He started to, once he realized he was in a safe place and that he was not going to be placed in this situation of violence at all. I also think they picked George because he's a big guy. He was actually bigger than me, which, I'm 6'2". I'm not a small guy, but he was also kind of bigger in a teddy bear-like way, let's say. So, it was, I think that was a part of the choice that was made by CYS based on the report that they would need someone of larger physical stature, a man even, perhaps of larger physical stature, because of the nature of the violent accusations against me. Mr. Mansoria represented to me that a second report had indeed, as Mrs. Smith had told me, been filed by St. Luke's Hospital and portrayed me as, quote, aggressive and, quote, violent. Mr. Mansoria specifically instructed Mr. Smith that even though his supervisor, Mr. Shaw, wanted him to obtain a urine sample from me for illegal drug testing, I was specifically advised by Mr. Mansoria not to do so. Not to do so. Don't do this. Mr. Smith heeded the advice of Mr. Mansoria and did not submit a urine test did not submit urine for an illegal drug test, so I wasn't going to anyway. Short of court order, that wasn't going to happen. Wasn't going to happen. And I better have been at that court hearing. Mr. Mansoria left the Smith family household with a positive image of the Smith family, which was contradictory to the reports of plaintiff Mr. Smith being an quote, aggressive, violent nature. Regardless of the nature of the interview, Mr. Smith was forced to testify against his consent and better judgment about personal family matters. So I had to talk to him about stuff, so it's not like it wasn't intrusive. So I really had to be larger than life at each step of this, because I couldn't be what people were saying that I was. By the very nature, I couldn't risk losing my other children because I was an angry dude. Right? At all times. In the hospital, I'm thinking that. On my way home from the hospital, I'm thinking that. All night when I can't sleep, and all weekend while I'm thinking that. I can't lose my other children, too. Your mind goes to terrible places, I promise you, when this kind of trauma has been injected into you. Yeah, okay. So, then after Mr. Mansoria left, he left on good terms, in a friendly manner. Quite frankly, I was talking with him about his potential, like his future life goals and going to law school and stuff like that. And 'cause he's, probably 10 years younger than me at least. And so, in any event, it left on a very positive foot. So I called Grace after that so we could exchange our experiences. After the CYS agent had left, Grace noticed immediately after that conversation that the security guard was no longer outside the NICU, and newborn baby Jazz had been approved for discharge. After plaintiff newborn baby Jazz were just discharged, a quote, and I believe, printer issue developed, and it apparently became impossible to print out the appropriate discharge paperwork. The printer issues went on for over an hour. After having been traumatized for having to stay at a hospital for days against her consent, they are dragging out every last possible moment with anxiety and anguish. Because of a print, they can't find a whole printer in the whole hospital that's going to work. There's no... They're all having printer issues. Eventually, and get this, they printed out her discharge papers on the back of a sheet of stickers. Real professional. Plaintiff Mrs. Smith was made aware that newborn baby Jazz would still not be discharged until Mrs. Smith signed a document stating that her hospital bracelet matched the bracelet worn by plaintiff newborn baby Jazz. Guess what? Because they had kicked her out, right? What was she missing now? A bracelet. And so, because it had been removed at home on the 10th because it felt like a handcuff burning us. I don't know how else to put it. And she wasn't provided a replacement when she had returned. Does that sound like it should be protocol? I don't know. Newborn baby Jazz didn't have a bracelet on for an unknown reason either, so neither she nor he had a bracelet, but she was being told in order to get her child back, she had to sign a piece of paper stating that they both had bracelets that matched. On the way out, disabled in postpartum, Mrs. Smith was not even offered a wheelchair when offered to exit St. Luke's Hospital. Mrs. Smith was forced to request assistance from hospital staff to carry belongings with her to the exit. Mrs. Smith was told that defendant St. Luke's Hospital would not provide her with either a cart to assist her baby and his belongings or a wheelchair to assist a disabled postpartum woman. So, can I have help with this? No. Cold no. Hard no. I want to make clear that, her parents couldn't come in to help her. That's why she had to ask for help. Because the previous day, right, they had been kicked out. So they can't come back in. Or else they're going to get arrested. So they can't come get their grandchild out of the hospital after this whole situation. Help their postpartum disabled daughter get out of the hospital to leave their very property without being arrested. Care you can trust, ladies and gentlemen. Plaintiff Mrs. Smith successfully finally exited the hospital on the afternoon of April 12th. Injuries related to newborn baby Jazz as a result of the abuse he suffered at the hands of St. Luke's Hospital did not cease upon his exit from the hospital. Over the course of the next few weeks, my baby boy developed the potentially fatal condition of pyloric stenosis. Yes, that's right. After this traumatic situation where we no longer trust any doctors, our young boy, because of treatment related, we really believe because of treatment related to him getting copious amounts of antibiotics in those first few days of life that were unnecessary, it led to having the condition of pyloric stenosis. Now you're probably wondering what that is. I would encourage you to go and Google it. Essentially, it is a hardening of the sphincter between the stomach and the intestines, and so because food cannot pass through nor any other liquid, what the child ends up doing is vomiting up and vomiting hard. We didn't understand what was going on, and as soon as we realized that our child wasn't keeping any food down for any appreciable length of time, and he started to become kind of pallid, we realized that we needed to get our child to the hospital immediately. And my goodness, am I glad that we did. I really believe that my newborn baby was very close to death. He had surgery, and this is not an uncommon surgery, okay? But he had surgery at Lehigh Valley Hospital. They corrected the condition. Now the nice thing about pyloric stenosis is once it's cured, it is cured. There's no going back. They literally cut a hole in the sphincter, and it's open. And food and breast milk, and breast milk at that point is what passed through. And he won't vomit it up. Well, that concludes my tale about rats. Nothing quite compares to them, do they? In any event, if you found this video compelling and are interested in learning more about the Smith family case against St. Luke's Hospital and its affiliates, please select the like and subscribe buttons below. Each Sunday, I will focus on a new aspect of the case and how you can help to make a difference. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to let me know in the comments. But try to keep in mind that I'm not only acting as a lawyer in this situation, I am one of the victims too. As well, if you are interested in helping my family through this difficult time, at this point I ask that you share this video across platforms to help bring attention to the injustices that my family has suffered, and to discuss this case with as many people as you can, so that together we can work towards policies that prevent what happened to my family from happening to others. And I will say from the video analytics that I've looked at, sharing videos of mine across platforms makes a big difference. So it's an easy way to help participate in this process, so we can help make real, effective, tangible change, right? That's always one of the problems that we have when we're looking to make change. It's what can you walk away with for real? Here, we can do something. We can get a little bit of progress. Each little notification, each little complaint that you make, each little advertisement of this situation places a little more pressure on the defendants to act in a fashion in the future that is conducive to not only acknowledging, but ensuring that people's constitutional rights, people's Pennsylvania constitutional rights, people's statutory rights, people's common law rights, all of those things were violated in my instant situation, in this instant case. We have to help make sure that we create policies in which this doesn't happen anymore. Next week, we'll get into the facts section, the last facts section of this case before moving on to the court brief, then to start understanding the broad strokes overall of the legal case. The court brief episodes are going to be much shorter. So there's one more long episode after this that's going to go over a facts section that has pertinent facts to the case, but don't go in chronology. So there are things that you need to know, like, for instance, Grace Smith never consumed methamphetamine. Straight up things like that. It's a shorter section than the previous two. The video itself should be shorter. It should move along at a faster clip. And then the following week, like I said, we will move in. I may move into a live format, talking about, in the beginning, some of the stuff that has to do with the court brief, and if I'm garnering enough interest in the case at that point, then it can turn into a Q&A session. So we will see, okay? I hope you'll stick with me. Until next week, my friends, I wish you all good health and long life.